Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and welcome to the third season of the Vimy Foundation's podcast, Beyond the Ridge, a series promoting Canada's contributions to the First World War and the experts who continue to uncover our past. My name is Caitlin Bailey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Vimy Foundation. Today, we have a special guest joining us. Sarah Worthman is a freelance researcher, I should say, and a writer from St. John's, Newfoundland. Sarah researches a variety of topics, including human security, political history, and queer theory. Sarah received funding from the LGBT Purge Fund to conduct research on the history of LGBT persecution during the First World War. Sarah spent time working with Veterans Affairs Canada, where she began her research on the history of LGBTQ soldiers in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and is now the Executive Director of the Newfoundland Queer Research Initiative, who have, as we learned, recently launched the NL Digital Queer Archive. So congratulations, Sarah, first on launching your archive. Super news. So we're really happy to hear that. And thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. It is definitely a labor of love with those archives. So I'm very grateful to see it kind of paying off. And now it's out into the world. So, we're really encouraging everyone to check it out.
Absolutely. Well, it's great. You have to, you spend so much time organizing a project, and then you have to let it out and hope that people use it, which is always, I think, the part for me anyway, that's really stressful.
Right? It's almost like really the stuff that seems harder on paper.
Yeah.
Like actually getting everything together is the easy part. And then now you have to kind of show it to the world and hope people actually like it, which is very scary sometimes. For sure.
It is really scary. Hope that they use it. So I guess my first question, I ask this to everyone, and we get many different answers, but my first question for you is just how you started to get interested in the First World War. What was it that really drew you to it as a topic?
Yeah, so for me, really, the First World War was very much part of that family history narrative. Growing up, we had a great uncle who died in the war. And so, I'm a Newfoundlander, so every kind of what on the mainland is Canada Day, for us was Memorial Day. And my dad was very adamant that we have our Memorial Day ceremonies in the morning and then continue on to our Canada Day stuff. And so, just growing up hearing about these stories really piqued my interest. And then when I was about 16, I went on a pilgrimage to all of the different caribou memorials that are located in France, and now one in Gallipoli, which is quite cool. And so there was no Gallipoli though when I was 16, unfortunately, although that would have been quite cool, quite a cool trip.
No trip to Turkey for you.
No, although I would like to go. That's on my bucket list now is to make it over to Turkey. But I was very much interested from that moment on, and I started to kind of ask those questions. Where are all of the 2SLGBTQIA plus people, or as I'll be kind of referring to in the historical context as queer, and you see some typical narratives that often repeat about the First World War. And I was just so curious because you have all of these, people of the same gender in these very homosocial spaces. And you're telling me that none of them were queer. And so that's kind of where the question first started. And it has since kind of evolved from there. When I was working as a tour guide, when I was 18 over in France, I used some of our free time that we would have for research to look into this. And I really found that, while there's a lot written about other places, and specifically within poetry, there isn't a whole lot written about the Canadian context. And so that's how this project, initially grew.
And so, I mean, I guess my next question for you, you're researching a piece of the historical narrative that is not very well known, not super well documented, at least publicly. So what do you think some of the challenges are when you're trying to uncover some of these histories? You know, what sort of records are you using? How are you drawing some of the conclusions that you've drawn in your work that you did for the Purge Fund?
Yeah, a lot of my work focuses on court martials.
Mm,
So courts martial, they were essentially the military disciplinary system, and they could prosecute kind of this wide range of both civil and military offenses. And so in looking at these court martial records that are held by Library and Archives Canada, I started to notice this category of gross indecency. And so it was from drawing on those records that a lot of this research came from. And you see these men at some of the most vulnerable points in their lives, having their, the most intimate parts of their personal life being read out in front of the entire court.
hmm
And then after the trial, they were, quite publicly outed as part of, what the military deemed important for military discipline.
hmm
And so, it's very detailed records, which I'm kind of fortunate to have in a way, but it also feels quite intimate and privileged to be able to read that
hmm
and to read such detailed explicit moments that weren't meant to be shared with anyone,
hmm
let alone in a court trial.
hmm
And so that's kind of where the bulk of my records lie. I also use a lot of scrapbooks from the First World War and work kind of backwards from census records. There were a few people who self-identified as partners, for example, on census documents. And as well, there are a few nursing sister couples that are buried together.
hmm
And so those are kind of starting points. But, really the bulk of my research lies in kind of the sad part of history where these men were being persecuted simply because of how they were born and who they loved.
hmm So those courts martial records, those are public records at this point.
Yes. Yes, although I will caution anyone who wants to dabble in them, it's not the most user-friendly, to put it lightly. They were all scanned in the 60s, and so these scans are really basically what's left of it. And Canada's actually quite privileged because all of the other, from what I can tell, court-martial transcripts within the British Empire burned
Mm,
as
hmm
part of the Blitz in the Second World War. So when I went to look, again, as I mentioned at the start, I'm a Newfoundlander, so I was very curious to see if there were any Newfoundland records similar to the Canadian ones. And when I went to go look, there actually was very few you know direct testimonies that remained,
hmm
and the only reason we have these ones is because the Canadian government at the time, you know they demanded a scanned copy of
hmm
every single one of the court martial transcripts and kept it thus in Ottawa, so safe away from the Blitz. So
hmm
they're quite a unique piece of material, but yeah, they're you definitely need at least a half hour to a full afternoon, depending, to try and
hmm
find just one article.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, and the Blitz is not, we don't think about that very much when we're thinking about Canadian military records, but we are very, very lucky in that we do have access to almost these complete attestation files for the First World War that now the British ones are all gone. So, it's really really interesting for all of the research that we're able to do now, especially now that they're all digitized. So I'm assuming most of the courts martial trials that you're looking at pertain to men. Um, for gross indecency charges, things like that. Did you ever find any evidence of women being charged under the courts martial trials, the nurses who came under military discipline?
No, I've yet to find a nurse. But that being said, kind of historically in Canada, um, it was more so specifically lesbian and queer women were persecuted through psychiatric facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I am keen, and that's kind of the next phase of this research, is to look into some of the health records,
Mm-hmm.
look at hospital diaries and things like that to see if any of the nurses were interned.
Mm-hmm.
But what I did find is, it was quite unique because it's almost a bit of a paradox because the men were being persecuted for the same thing. And yet within the nursing sister, within the Canadian Army Medical Corps, they were actually encouraging these types of relationships to foster and really allowed certain nurses to choose their specific bunkmates. There's a couple of instances where two women even combined their huts, their living spaces, to share a bed essentially, and then they made their other hut into a little sitting room for
Mm-hmm.
guests.
Mm-hmm.
So it was almost, it was part of this kind of narrative, that definitely still permeates, where intimacy between women tends to be kind of downplayed as just friendship. And I can tell you, I can attest to that personally, that that's still,
Mm-hmm.
that it still definitely is downplayed. And so that was really the big thing in the war, was that, well, we can't have the nursing sisters and by extension as well the voluntary aid detachment nurses. We can't have them, sleeping with any of their patients or any of the male doctors. So
Mm-hmm.
they allowed these kind of relationships to flourish, at
Mm-hmm.
least from what I can see. Again, this research is very preliminary. I was mostly focusing on the kind of legal background.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to need to do some refreshers into my medical jargon a little bit before I endeavor into the psychiatric kind of research. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really interesting. It was just kind of a question that occurred to me recently where I thought about that. I've done some work on PTSD and shell shock, and one of the things that struck me about the First World War again is that, people spend a lot of time talking about men suffering from shell shock, but women who were in the hospitals facing the same things aren't diagnosed ever as having shell shock. It's very hard to find a woman who is diagnosed as having shell shock. It's easier to find a woman who's diagnosed as being hysterical. Um, the famous, the H word that covers basically everything you could think of with a woman. So, it kind of is the same thing where it gets, well, it could be construed the same way, where it gets kind of treated through a different system because it's seen as being a different thing, and somehow not, not the same, which I think is kind of interesting. So I'm curious as well, a lot of what you're doing here, it's, as you mentioned earlier, you're looking into courts martial records. You're looking at some very um, graphic files. You're looking at, people who, to use your words, were then outed to their colleagues, to their comrades, I should say. So what are some of the ethical implications you find in terms of researching and particularly publishing some of the stories that you've uncovered?
So it's a very delicate way of going about it. And I often find myself having to weigh the pros and the cons. And specifically, one of the big things that I really want to do is highlight more so the individual behind the
Mhm.
trial, and not the trial itself. So while in the report I provide some initial context, I definitely try my best not to go into the most graphic components of it, because for me, that is really a private moment in their lives. And it was already exposed to so many people, that I think we owe it to them not to disclose that. But at the same time, I think, you have to weigh the question of outing versus not outing history. And I think one of the big things that I lie back on is that we have no idea how they would have felt if they lived in 2023.
Mm.
I wish I could just phone them up or go into a time machine. I think this would make a lot of our work quite a lot easier if we could just interview them directly. And so, you have to kind of weigh that. And I try to make sure that I'm doing it with honor and pride of who they are. And kind of, I think it's different than other kind of criminal research because it's not something that's in today's world inherently, at least it shouldn't be inherently shameful. Right. And the same thing, you get this dilemma with families who aren't as supportive, but I often find myself weighing a few upset family members, which I've actually yet to come across since this report has been published. Often family members are very excited and they've heard, the experience of these men kind of being passed down in family narratives and never getting justice. And so I kind of have to weigh that of potential upsets, descendants with the benefit that this would have for the community, the empowerment, the beauty, the incredibly empowering feeling that comes with seeing yourself represented in history, especially in an area like the First World War, where we've never, seen queer Canadians represented. We've never seen their identities celebrated, and we've never seen what they've experienced apologized for. So I draw a lot of that based on what their approach is to with the Auschwitz Museum. They have a really great policy on that, of course, with the pink triangles, and I think I similarly like to take that approach.
Yeah, well, it's definitely very interesting just to see that. Yeah, there's a you're drawing on a policy from another organization that's also had to deal with some really difficult cases and difficult things that again are not necessarily well talked about. The pink triangle and the Holocaust remains kind of a subject that doesn't draw as much attention as some of the other some of the other victims of the Holocaust. So it's interesting just to think about that there's a policy and a basis for how do you do this, how do you approach this. And one of the things that I wanted to ask, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier very specifically, but the idea of you are very intentional about using queer as your definition for the work that you've done, where you are saying, okay, we can suppose that this person is likely queer. So can you talk a little bit more about that and why that is the term you've chosen?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the standard within history typically to go with queer, simply because it's such an excellent umbrella term. It can it comprises, everything within the 2SLGBTQIA plus acronym and then some. And that is incredibly important when we look at history, because identities change so much over time. And I think if we were to go back in time and, call up Walt Whitman, for example, and if we referred to him as a gay man, he would have no idea what that meant. And so in the same way, we can't determine, maybe he liked women as well. Maybe he would be what we now consider bisexual. Maybe he had questions about his own gender and things kind of like that. So queer is this great catch-all, in that we can still recognize it as part of our community's heritage, while also kind of balancing this evolution of language. Even like homosexual, it was mostly used in medical terminology, really into the 70s. And people who were queer in the 70s often used homophile Instead, you see a lot of homophile associations across
Mm-hmm.
Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a similar way, this is just a great way to catch all. And but in that vein, as I say, language is always evolving. So who knows? Maybe in 10 years there'll be an even better term that we can use to kind of um, encapsulate these identities.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the next question, I mean, this is always the hard question with when you're trying to change narratives or introduce narratives, and the really big question is always, what kind of pushback comes from this, because you're dealing with something that um, is certainly a bit of a hot button issue right now. There's everything from homophobia to the viewpoints people have on, I guess they use it like a dirty word, but revisionism, all of those types of things. So what are you, and I don't think I don't really want to go into sort of the homophobic side of it, but something more around um, introducing different narratives and different perspectives. What's some of the pushback that you sometimes get for the work that you're doing, or do you get any pushback? I guess is another question.
What's been the answer is yes. Unfortunately, we're in a political climate right now where you even mention the 2SLGBTQIA plus community, and unfortunately, you get these very vitriolic affronts, sadly. But what's really interesting is when I first started this research, the landscape has changed so much. When I first started, I received very minimal pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I was telling people I was doing this research or, tweeting about some of the findings that I came across while writing the report, it was completely accepted. But there's been this kind of noticeable shift
Mm-hmm.
within that. But I think that the First World War has almost reached a bit of a mythological status sometimes in people's minds, and as well within kind of collective histories.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain narratives that are very, very dominant within that. And I think any challenge to these types of narrative, you do get a bit of pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way, part of that is growing pains. And part of it is a bit more, unfortunately, sinister and rooted in, the factors that that are involved in marginalization.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so I think, in a way, I think it's very necessary, but I think the pushback is also unfortunately inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've found, which has been really interesting, more pushback talking about men. No, sorry, opposite. Less pushback talking about men compared to pushback talking about women and nursing sisters.
Oh, that's
And again,
interesting.
I think it ties into this misogynistic idea that you know women in this era did not have a sexuality, did not have romantic relationships outside of men,
Mm-hmm.
and that has kind of persisted, and yeah, it's been quite interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also grateful that we're at a point where we can finally challenge this, and that there's some incredibly determined, I think is the best word, activists in Canada who are really kind of pushing for this recognition,
Mm-hmm.
because it's been 100 years of 100 odd years of not acknowledging this, and everything that is transgressed with the number two construction. With the number two construction battalion, it's quite fabulous to see, finally both the bravery of these men, but also the racism and hardship that they endured is coming to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I guess that brings me just to my closing question, and you've mentioned this already, but as you say, many of these stories are over 100 years old, and I think that there are people who would argue that they just should be left. They should be left to their privacy, I guess, or why are we making such a fuss? make a fuss over this group of people? So why is it important to you to continue to uncover these and share these stories?
I think the fact that we haven't heard it in 100 years says a lot about the lack of recognition
Mm-hmm.
that these communities have gotten within kind of traditional First World War commemorations. And that, you know, necessitates further acknowledgement, and the fact that, it's 100 years too late
Mm-hmm.
to acknowledge these people, and to recognize the hardship that these men uh, endured, and that these women's relationships were covered up.
Mm-hmm.
And so, on one hand, I think that that is incredibly important. But yet, at the same time, I think it challenges, as I mentioned, how the political landscape has changed so much in Canada towards the 2SLGBTQIA plus community, and we're seeing these kind of rhetorics resurfacing that queerness and queer identity is a choice almost, or something that is like taught in the education system simply because there's inclusive education, and there's histories being shared like the ones I'm sharing today. And so it's, I think, more important now than ever to recognize this history and say, well, here are 19 men who did not learn about this in school, who did not grow up with inclusive education. They grew up in a very heteronormative world where their existence was quite literally criminal. And yet, despite this, despite all of the persecution, they stayed true to their identity, and they were queer nonetheless. And I think that's very powerful evidence against this narrative. And it empowers me to share these stories and continue to do so.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And just a reminder for everyone that the NL Digital Queer Archive is now live and accessible to anyone with a computer. So congratulations on that. And we're wishing you all the success possible with making sure that these important documents are available for people to look at and learn from. So it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the third season of Beyond the Ridge. Stay tuned as we have many more topics that we're going to be covering, including colonialism, the practice of public history in military history, and identification of First World War remains. The Vimy Foundation works to preserve and promote Canada's ongoing legacy of leadership through its educational programs to build a future informed, we hope, by the past. Thank you again, Sarah.